She stood alone, a wrinkled nun in worn shoes, gripping the edge of a grand piano no one wanted her to touch. "She's just the cook," someone sneered. Security moved in. But then, the Pope raised a hand. Silence fell. She sat, played one note, and the air cracked open, gasps, tears, the melody, haunting, holy, dragged memories from the depths. Bombs, ashes, children clinging to life, the Vatican frozen. And when the final note dropped like a feather, they realized the truth. She was the lost composer of Sanctus. They tried to silence her. Instead, she healed the world. You have to hear this. The air inside the Clementine Hall was perfumed with the scent of polished wood, old velvet and candle wax, and something colder. Deference, maybe, or the chill of centuries. It was the kind of silence that dressed itself in gold, hushed, heavy, reverent, yet unkind to those who didn't belong. The audience, distinguished and severe, sat in rows like painted statues. Bishops, cardinals, world-renowned composers, and scholars of liturgical music. Their hands folded neatly, eyes trained on the stage where the grand piano waited beneath a pool of soft amber light. Somewhere behind them, in the margins of this opulent room, stood an elderly nun. She was small. So small she looked, like part of the furniture. A chair left in the corner, a forgotten cushion. Her habit was simple, gray as winter fog, her shoes scuffed. No jewelry, no name card. Just Sister Maria, holding a sheaf of sheet music and the quiet dignity of someone used to being overlooked. She wasn't on the program. Not really. When she approached the piano, eyes followed her like flies to still water. Whispers curled through the room. Who allowed this? She's just a convent sister. A pianist? Impossible. A man in a tailored black suit, sharp chin, sharper voice, intercepted her with an apologetic smile that was more steel than sympathy. "Sister, I'm afraid this isn't appropriate." She stopped, bowed slightly, stepped back, not angry, not ashamed, just accustomed. Her fingers, still curled around the music, trembled once, then stilled. She turned to return to her shadowed place. And then, "Let her play," said a voice from the front, soft, but absolute. Heads turned. The Pope himself sat forward in his seat, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. His face was unreadable, not cruel, not kind, simply watchful. A hush fell, not polite this time. Stunned, no one argued. Sister Maria stepped forward once more, her steps slow, unhurried, the way one might walk into a sacred memory. She reached the piano, brushed the keys with her fingers like reacquainting with an old friend. Sat, no warm-up, no rustle of pages, just breath. Then, a single note, low, pure, like a bell in fog. It hung in the air, trembling, before folding into the next. And the next, a phrase, a question. People shifted. The room felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too still, and then the music unfurled, not loud, not grand, but aching, raw. It didn't ask for attention, it commanded stillness. Each note sounded like it had traveled through someone's body before reaching the keys. The murmurs died. The critics leaned in. The Pope closed his eyes, and somewhere, beneath that ceiling painted with saints and heavens, Sister Maria played as if time itself were listening. Her hands, thin and veined, moved like prayers over the keys, not performing, not impressing, remembering. By the third minute, even the chandeliers seemed to lean in. No one knew it then, but this was the moment it all began to change. Moment when silence would give way to revelation, when forgotten bombs and lullabies would rise like ghosts through marble walls. When a room that had dismissed her would learn the sound of a soul that had waited 70 years to be heard, and the world, though it didn't know yet, was about to be healed by a melody that had almost been lost forever. The moment Sister Maria's hands began to move, something ancient stirred in the walls. It wasn't just music, it was memory. Her fingers, though aged, traced the keys with the softness of someone not playing a piano, but touching something, once taken from her. Each note spilled like breath held too long. She didn't look up, didn't seek applause. Her eyes remained half-lidded, as if watching something only she could see. And behind her, the hall transformed. The distinguished guest sat frozen, not by spectacle, but by an inexplicable feeling rising through their bones, the type that defied intellect. The kind that made you forget your name and just feel. The music crept into their chests, under their skin. At first it was quiet, a gentle motif, almost a whisper. Then came a swell, a rising, notes that fluttered like sparrows startled from trees. Then silence again. Not absence, but reverence. A woman in the second row gasped, not because she recognized the melody, but because she remembered something. In her mind's eye, rubble, broken glass. Her mother weeping beside a collapsed building in Milan, and faint music, drifting in through a cracked church window. The same music. She hadn't heard it since she was 6. A man 3 rows behind her clenched his fists in his lap, his face pale. The same melody had once echoed through the tunnels of a monastery during the winter of '44, when his older brother died in the snow. These weren't isolated memories. They were fragments that surfaced, uninvited, urgent. Because the melody didn't belong to anyone. It belonged to everyone. The camera inside the Vatican live-streamed the performance to a modest viewership, mostly students of sacred music. But within minutes, something odd happened. Comments began flooding in. Where have I heard this before? My grandmother used to hum this in a refugee camp. Wait, is this the Sanctus? No, it's different, deeper. The Pope, his hands clasped before his mouth, whispered something to his aide. Find the name of this piece. Immediately. And still, Sister Maria played, her back curved with the music, her shoulders lifting with each crescendo like wings straining to open. And every note became a door, behind it, memories long sealed. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled the room like light through stained glass, golden, broken, beautiful. And then, a sudden shift. The music dipped, slowed, like the moment just before a bomb lands, and in that pause, the entire room held its breath. Then came a minor chord, aching, deliberate, a phrase that trembled like a child's sob. The melody stumbled, then rose again, fierce and defiant. No longer mourning, but fighting. The tempo surged, not with speed, but with gravity. She was no longer just playing, she was telling. And what? She told no one could explain, but everyone understood. War, hunger, shelter in basements, fear in the dark. A battered upright piano dragged into a cellar. Dozens of children, one nun, one song. They saw it, they felt it. The performance ended not with thunder, but with a final note so soft it barely touched the room. A feather of sound, suspended. It hung there, then fell, and silence crashed in. But not the polite kind. It was the silence that comes after a revelation, the kind that breaks you open. For a long moment, no one moved. And then someone, no one remembered who, began to cry, not loudly, but honestly. Others followed, tears that had waited decades for permission. The Pope rose slowly and walked toward the piano, his expression unreadable, reverent. He leaned down and asked, so quietly the microphones barely caught it, "What is this?" Sister Maria looked up at him for the first time, not proud, not defiant, just calm. "It is called Sanctus," she whispered. "I wrote it in 1943. The silence deepened. No one believed her. No one dared believe. But somewhere in a forgotten Vatican archive, buried in a drawer of unclaimed compositions, a faded manuscript bore a title written in the same hand, same curves, same quiet. Forgotten Sanctus, anonymous 1943. Not anymore. The world was about to remember, and it would never be the same. It began with a whisper in the archives. The morning after her performance, Vatican scholars descended the marble steps into the sealed chamber, where lost manuscripts slept in quiet dust. They carried Sister Maria's handwritten score in shaking hands, scanning every drawer, every brittle parchment with rising urgency. And there, tucked between a century-old Gregorian motet and an unclaimed Mass for the dead, they found it, yellowed, fragile but unmistakable. The same curving letters, the same breath of sadness folded into every measure. Sanctus, anonymous, 1943. Except now the name was no longer anonymous. They compared the ink strokes, the marginal notations, the slight curve on every F, the timid spacing between bars. All matched perfectly. It was hers and no one had known. No one had asked. The announcement broke quietly at first. A Vatican press note, subdued, cautious. The kind meant to drift quietly into scholarly circles, not headlines. But the live stream had already escaped its intended audience. Overnight, the video had been clipped, translated, reposted. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, filled with slow zooms. On her hands, tears on cheeks, the trembling silence after her final chord. It wasn't just music anymore. It was a moment, and people needed moments like this. A conductor in Boston postponed his entire program to open the next concert with a reconstruction of Sanctus, now labeled, composed by Sister Maria Elena Grimaldi, 1943. In South Korea, a violinist wept as she rehearsed the piece for a benefit concert, saying, "It sounds like my grandmother's goodbye." In Argentina, a woman played the performance on a loop beside her father's hospice bed. He hadn't spoken in weeks, but when Maria's melody reached the 5th minute, he whispered his wife's name. The world began to listen, not just to the music, but to her, and with attention came scrutiny. Pundits debated her credentials. Skeptics questioned the date. A few influential voices scoffed, "A nun, a composer of global genius? Isn't that a little dramatic?" But those who had heard the Sanctus live knew. They had felt it. In every note, there was history. There was grief. There was a knowledge too raw to fake. The Vatican, under immense pressure, launched an official investigation into the origins. They interviewed her former students, combed convent records, even contacted Red Cross archives. And a timeline emerged. In Day 43, young Sister Maria had lived at a small convent on the outskirts of Naples. The area had been bombed relentlessly. Dozens of orphans had taken refuge there. The nuns had no medical training, little food, but they had a battered piano. And every night amid sirens and dust, Maria had played. She had composed Sanctus not for posterity, not for performance, but as a prayer, a lullaby for the forgotten. They found testimonies, now elderly survivors, who still remembered the sound. "It made us feel alive," said one man, even when everything else was burning. Back in the Vatican, Sister Maria refused interviews. She remained in her small quarters, tending to laundry, helping prepare meals for the visiting poor. "I am not the story," she told the papal secretary when he offered her a televised tribute. "The music is," but the music didn't stay. The Vatican, it traveled. In refugee camps across Europe, volunteers played Sanctus over loudspeakers. Children, many parentless, some mute from trauma, sat quietly, wide-eyed, as if the song was a language they remembered. In Brazilian prisons, inmates requested it in place of their usual Sunday sermons. In Manila, an artist who hadn't painted in 4 years listened once and started to sketch again. Healing, unmeasurable, untamed, followed wherever it went. And still, some resisted. Critics from elite conservatories labeled the piece emotionally manipulative. Others claimed it borrowed too heavily from sacred chants, reducing its originality. But their voices grew small, background static in a rising wave of gratitude. Because something had shifted. It wasn't just that the world rediscovered a piece of lost music. It's that the world remembered how to feel it. In a time when headlines screamed and algorithms divided, Sanctus moved quietly, like balm on burned skin. It made no promises, offered no answers, it just sat with people, listened. And in the center of it all was a woman who had asked for nothing. Sister Maria received letters, thousands, most unanswered. A few she opened. One, from a former child soldier in Congo, simply read, "I didn't know how to forgive myself, but your song made me try." Another, from a pianist who had lost both hands in a car accident, said, "I played it in my mind, every night. I remembered what beauty felt like." And then there was the girl from Syria, barely 12, her village bombed, her family lost. She had drawn a picture, a piano in the middle of a desert with children around it, hands on their hearts. Beneath it, in careful English, she had written, "Sister Maria plays even when the world is broken." And so she did. Even as interviews came, even as documentaries were filmed, even as she was nominated for awards she refused to attend, Maria played. In churches, in hospitals, in corners of shelters where hope was fragile and flickering, because the music was never about performance. It was always a remembering and a promise that even in the darkest days, something soft, something sacred would endure. It was meant to be a ceremony, polished, televised, meticulous, the Vatican's official tribute to Sister Maria, a grand event beneath the Sistine Chapel's painted heavens, rows of robed dignitaries, a televised broadcast, a rare gathering of musical luminaries. The world was watching, but Sister Maria wasn't there. She had slipped out quietly that morning before sunrise, leaving behind only a folded note on her bedside table. "I go where the wounded wait. Let the lights shine on them." There was no signature, only a pressed violet inside. Cameras scanned the empty chair where she was meant to sit. Commentators whispered confusion. But somewhere, far from the flashing bulbs and rehearsed speeches, a different story unfolded. That same evening, in a small hospice tucked behind Rome's crumbling walls, Sister Maria sat by a boy's bed. He was 6, his breath shallow, his eyes barely open. She played, not loudly, not theatrically, just a lullaby version of Sanctus, reshaped for one pair of ears. A nurse watched from the hallway, covering her mouth, because in that moment, the boy smiled. He hadn't smiled in days. The world, meanwhile, clung tighter to her story. But the tighter they held, the more she stepped back. Every attempt to raise her as a figurehead, an icon of humility, a face for global healing, she gently declined. She refused every nomination, donated every award, declined magazine covers. When asked for her permission to publish a biography, she simply said, "Only if it ends with others, not me." But the attention came anyway. It grew larger, more relentless. And with attention came opposition. A popular TV host questioned the validity of her authorship. A nun with no formal conservatory education? Are we romanticizing ignorance? Another viral thread claimed the piece was likely compiled from fragments of older works, suggesting Maria had stitched together music from memory, unintentionally or otherwise. She never responded. Others did. Thousands. Professional musicians uploaded side-by-side comparisons, revealing the originality of Sanctus' chord progressions, its unique timing. Scholars unearthed her original manuscript and supporting documentation from wartime archives. Survivors from the orphanage she served in Naples offered video testimonies, remembering her fingers, that piano, that melody. But it wasn't evidence that silenced the critics. It was what happened next. A major philharmonic orchestra performed Sanctus live, in full, with 120 instruments, a children's choir, and a cathedral packed to the brim. And during the final chord, the power cut out. No lights, no sound system. Silence. Gasps. Then, from the darkness, a small voice began to hum, a child, then another, and another. Soon, the entire choir sang the closing bars in darkness. 1,000 voices joined them. No orchestra, no spotlight, just humanity and harmony. That moment was broadcast worldwide, not through any camera, but through every heart that watched. Suddenly, Sanctus was no longer a composition. It was a movement. Churches, added it to their Easter services. Schools played it during memorials. Counselors used it in grief therapy. Radio stations closed the day with its final bars, and in an unexpected twist, artists began creating from it. Painters captured its mood in swirling colors. Dancers choreographed it into motion. Poets etched its rhythms into elegies and love letters. Each one carried a piece of her, of what she had endured, what she had transformed. Even those who had dismissed her now paused, not because they had changed their minds, but because the world around them had. Sister Maria remained unchanged, lived quietly in a smaller convent now, nestled by a river. Her piano was old, the stool uneven, but she played each morning as if no one had ever heard her before, as if the world still needed a gentle reminder. Then one day, the Pope visited, unannounced, without entourage. He came during a morning. Mass knelt beside her after the final hymn and whispered, "Your music restored more faith than my sermons ever could." She looked at him, kind, tired, luminous. "Because I never tried to teach," she said, "only to feel." He bowed his head. "Will you play it for me?" She nodded once, and in that small chapel, with birds fluttering outside and the scent of rain on stone, she played Sanctus again, not as an anthem, not as a triumph, but as a gift, soft, slow, and shimmering with the quiet power of things that cannot be bought or stolen or explained, things that refuse to be silenced. Winter had softened its grip on Rome. The days were cool but no longer cruel, and the morning light spilled gently across the Vatican gardens like honey across old stone. A modest ceremony had been arranged, at the insistence of others, not of Sister Maria. There were no trumpets, no grand procession, just an unveiling. A single moment beneath a fig tree where history had chosen at last to speak aloud the name it once buried. The statue was simple. She sat at the piano, shoulders slightly bowed, hands forever frozen mid-melody. Around her, cast in bronze, children leaned in, not in worship but in wonder. There was no pedestal, she wouldn't have wanted one. At the base, a quiet inscription read, "She did not play to be heard. She played so others could heal." The Pope himself stood beside the sculpture, not to deliver a speech, but to listen. As the children's choir sang Sanctus, every word, every note floated upward like incense, brushing the edges of heaven, and still, Sister Maria was not there. She had watched the rehearsal quietly the day before, touched the cold bronze of her younger self, whispered a prayer, then returned to her room in the convent by the river. She would not attend. Her presence was everywhere now anyway. Months passed, seasons turned, but the echo of her music grew, louder. In Norway, a woman battling terminal illness requested Sanctus as her final breath's accompaniment. In Kenya, an orphanage built a small school named Maria's Room, where children could learn music, not to impress, but to express. In Ukraine, amid shattered cities, a violinist played Sanctus in the ruins of a theater, live-streamed to millions. It was no longer a piece. It was a prayer passed from hand to hand, voice to voice, a balm for grief, a companion to solitude, a spark for the hopeless. And somewhere in a modest town in Italy, Sister Maria continued her quiet rituals. She still rose before dawn, still made tea with honey, still sat at her creaky piano, hands more hesitant now, movement slower. But the music still came, sometimes all at once, sometimes in aching pauses. She wrote a new piece, left no name on it. It was found weeks later by a visiting novice nun who, while cleaning, discovered the handwritten score beneath the altar cloth of the chapel. No title, just notes that wept and soared. They named it Pax. Then one morning the piano went silent. Sister Maria had passed, quietly in her sleep, rosary still in hand. No grand announcement was made, but within hours the news circled the world, not from networks but from hearts. Refugees lit candles, schools held moments of silence, artists created tribute reels, street musicians played Sanctus on corners where prayers had once gone unanswered. Indeed, Viral video. A cellist in New York began playing the melody in a subway station. One by one, strangers joined. Flute, violin, voice. By the end, a full impromptu orchestra had formed. None had rehearsed. But they all knew the song, because it had never been about notes on a page. It had always been a reminder that in the noise of the world, there would always be a place for silence, for feeling, for healing. Sister Maria was buried in a small plot, behind the convent. No grand mausoleum, just a wooden cross and a garden of wild violets. But the world did not forget. The Vatican canonized Sanctus as a permanent piece in the Church's musical canon. Major conservatories created an annual Maria Grimaldi composition grant, open only to unrecognized or self-taught musicians. Its first recipient was a teenage girl from a war zone who composed music using rainwater jars and broken xylophones. She said Maria taught her how to listen, even in chaos, even in silence. The final frame of the documentary, released a year after Maria's death, shows her in black and white, at the piano, unaware she's being filmed. The camera lingers on her face, eyes closed, her lips barely parted as she plays the opening bars of Sanctus. And as the music swells, the screen fades to black. But the sound continues. Because it was never just about music. It was about a woman who, despite the world's indifference, chose to keep playing, and in doing so, reminded us what it means to be human. She did not seek glory. She gave hope. If Sister Maria's story touched your heart, if her music reminded you of something forgotten, something soft and sacred, please consider sharing this video. Let her legacy ripple a little farther. And if you'd like to stay connected to more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of our shared humanity, we'd be honored to have you subscribe. One share, one click. It might be the note someone else needs today.